Hi, everyone. My name is Erika Dyck. I'm very pleased to be part of this seminar series on psychedelics and psychoanalysis. And I am going to attempt to share my screen with you all and do my presentation. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks especially to Timmy for this invitation and for inviting me to be part of this series. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about what I'm going to call the poetics of psychosis. And this is some research that I have been doing roughly for the past 20 years or so, looking at the history of psychedelics, but also looking at some of the people behind the early research in the 1950s, those who coined the word psychedelics. And I will move on and talk about that in just a moment. Make sure my screen moves properly. So I suspect in an audience like this, the story about the emergence or discovery of LSD is well known to many of you here, so I won't belabor this point. But we all know that in 1938, LSD was first synthesized from an ergot derivative, and it wasn't until 1943 that Albert Hofmann, pictured here in Sandoz Pharmaceutical Laboratories, first experienced its effects. And I'm sure some of you may have read his work on this or have looked at many of the ways in which his work has been memorialized as, launching this really powerful new chemical into our psychiatric landscapes. One person, Stanislav Grof, described this as introducing, or he says here, Dr. Hoffman's discovery of LSD generated a powerful wave of interest in brain chemistry, and together with the development of tranquilizers, was directly responsible for what has been called the golden age of psychopharmacology. And I wanted to sort of emphasize this point as we become comfortable with the history of this, of the idea of LSD the idea that LSD introduced a new way of thinking about psychiatry is a little bit muddled, I think, when we try to contextualize and try to keep in mind the really substantial changes that were taking place at mid-20th century in the field of psychiatry. And the really important discoveries or the important innovations of psychopharmacology that changed the landscape and changed the way we were thinking about treating mental illness. If we look at major psychiatric publications at the time, or if we even look at regular medical publications at the time, we start to see just a dramatic change in the way that pharmaceuticals are being sold to psychiatrists, but also to physicians more broadly. And I've just gathered a few different examples here. A colleague and I have been working on this history and looking at how advertisements for psychopharmaceuticals are being peddled throughout the world at this time. And it's amazing to see the consistency and the clear messages that mental illnesses, and here we see examples, we see chlorpromazine, so antipsychotic medications, but we can also see mood stabilizers, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications a little bit later. And they all sort of target this notion, this linking of psychopharmacology and mental illness, and they forge that connection. You can see images here of a brain in one example, really trying to showcase the idea that science and medicine has conquered mental illness through the introduction of psychopharmacology. And this is poised, of course, to overwhelm other forms of therapy or other ways of even theorizing distress and trauma. So my story today centers on Humphrey Osmond, who was a psychiatrist who was trained in the United Kingdom. He worked for a time at a variety of different hospitals, Guy's Hospital. He was briefly connected with the Maudsley Hospital. And in 1951, he came to Saskatchewan in Canada. So this is the province that is marked in red on the map there. And Humphrey Osmond arrived as the superintendent, or within a few months, he became the superintendent of the Saskatchewan Provincial Mental Hospital in Weyburn, which is roughly in the southeast corner of that rectangular province. Saskatchewan was an important incubator for mental health reforms at mid-century. In 1944, this province had elected the first socialist government in North America, and that government was elected on promises of bringing publicly funded healthcare to the region, which they succeeded in doing This became a blueprint for the rest of Canada. So like the NHS, Canada's Medicare, of course, has a patchy history, and there are lots of tensions there, a subject of a different conversation. But the idea that a publicly funded healthcare system could be created and supported was developed here in the region. And Osmond came in at this auspicious moment. It's perhaps not coincidental that he came in at this moment, because the government in charge was specifically recruiting physicians, as well as a number of other sort of middle-class professionals into the region in order to participate in creating a publicly funded healthcare system. So Osmond arrived in Saskatchewan in 1951, already with a keen interest in the history of psychosis and the way that psychosis manifested in human behavior. And then also as he tried to understand both its origins, its pathology, but in particular, its treatment. And part of what was fascinating to Osmond was trying to listen carefully to psychotic patients. Now, this is something that he felt psychoanalysts, many of whom were his colleagues in England, were not as good at doing. He felt that the field of psychoanalysis did not have enough skills or enough theories to listen to psychotic patients or to make sense of the disorganized speech, if you will, of psychotic patients. And he felt that this was a missed opportunity. One of his interests in psychedelics came from recognizing this gap between trying to understand psychosis and trying to apply psychoanalysis. For him, substances that caused hallucinations, psychomimetic drugs, as he called them initially, and others, of course, called it this, so psychosis mimicking drugs, he felt offered a really important window into understanding psychosis, even empathizing with psychosis through this chemically triggered response. So he started sharing these ideas with his friends and his colleagues. This is an image from 1953 when he had already begun psychedelic trials. You can see he's surrounded by other folks in white coats. The fellow in the red shirt is actually a journalist in this instance, and he has traveled from Ottawa, Canada, in Ontario to Saskatchewan in order to participate in an LSD trial. Now, this is a public trial. This was a kind of manufactured trial that was meant to bring public attention to this issue, and it did. What they were doing in this instance, there were sort of two key goals to what Osmond's research was aimed at by 1953. One was to use drugs like LSD and mescaline, and later they would investigate with psilocybin as well, in order to produce a model psychosis. That is to cause a disorientation, to make people not trust their own logic, or to challenge people's sense of reality such that they didn't have confidence anymore in what they were able to express. And this was really important to Osmond as a feature of trying to get people, staff members in particular, to empathize or to understand their patients who were diagnosed with schizophrenia in particular. The other arm of the research was using psychedelics to treat alcoholism. And this is something I'm not going to get into in this talk, and I'm happy to answer questions about this later if you like. Sidney Katz, the journalist who traveled to Saskatchewan, decided he would participate in this experiment rather freely and publicly, and they hired an artist to follow him around. They had a sort of scribe, someone who was capturing his words, and then, of course, Sidney Katz wrote about this on his own. This was published in the Maclean's magazine, which was one of Canada's popular magazines. It reached many, many, sort of thousands of homes and introduced the world of psychedelics. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. The word psychedelic wasn't coined yet. Introduced this world of madness, as they called it, to a number of Canadians. This also sparked the curiosity of people like Aldous Huxley. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this story as well. Aldous Huxley, of course, had already written about hallucinogenic drugs and had also written about consciousness studies in his very, very popular books. And in 1956, he and Humphrey Osmond started corresponding, and this led to his first mescaline trip and, of course, the book, The Doors of Perception. And it's through their correspondence that the word psychedelic comes to be. I'm just going to show you some images here from a graphic novel that is currently in production that tries to capture this moment as well. And I'll leave this on the screen for you to take a look at on your own. I don't want to fixate on the language or the text so much here, but this idea that Aldous Huxley, is transfixed by what psychedelic drugs offer, by what these hallucinogens offer, was something that has been memorialized and has been caricatured in some respects as in the launching of the psychedelic research. Aldous Huxley, of course, is a gifted writer. He's very well connected. He is a philosopher. He is very highly connected to both genetically and in social sense to biologists. Of course, his brother was a knighted biologist in England. And he fuses these ideas of science and philosophy, and even to some degree, spirituality in his writings and in his musings on this topic of what these drugs, what these substances offer, what kind of tools they are or gifts to human consciousness studies. And Huxley is really fascinated by the way that sort of blending of these genres, the blending of these ideas. And he and Humphrey Osmond become fast friends. In fact, from the very moment that they meet in 1953, they carry on a friendship that lasts right into Huxley's death in 1963. They write to each other quite frequently. They visit each other as often as they can. And they become very close friends. It's Humphrey Osmond who gives the eulogy, one of the eulogies to Aldous Huxley after his death. So I wanted to just share something here. This is from the letters of them back and forth. And I want to sort of pull into the ways in which they are conceptualizing psychedelics in disciplinary ways, but also in terms of in practical terms when it comes to therapy. So this is a quote from Humphrey Osmond. The date there is the letter when he wrote to Aldous Huxley. He says, "Of course, I agree that many of our sick people would not be sick if we valued their experiences. They would be explorers of the other. But as the priest relentlessly doomed the prophet and was in consequence easily himself doomed by the blind scientist, the schizophrenic person had his experiences entirely devalued." And you can go on and read this section. And this, of course, he continues to elaborate on this in his writings. But one of the things I'm really fascinated by in this exchange is, in this passage rather, is the way that Osmond talks about the need to think about experiences and to treasure or value or even study those experiences, those psychotic experiences. This is not something that is readily done through psychopharmacology. It is something that relies on a different kind of therapeutic model. And that's what I'm going to pull through in the rest of this presentation. For those of you in the audience who appreciate seeing sort of the historical records, as I do at least, I wanted to just give you a quick snapshot here of the original letters between Huxley and Osmond as they are trying to write out and trying to come up with the term to capture the sensations or responses that they felt drugs like LSD and mescaline caused. So now I can stop stumbling over my words. Now I can use the word psychedelic. You can see, and perhaps you can even read a little bit of the writing on the left-hand side of the screen. So Aldous Huxley's wife, Maria, has typed up a letter to Humphrey Osmond, and Osmond is already sort of jotting down ideas in it as he receives the letter and, within a day sends back his own. You can see that Aldous Huxley says in his letter, "To make this mundane world sublime, just half a gram of phanerothym," as he tries to introduce this word phanerothym. Osmond responds, and you can see it for yourself here, "To fathom hell or go angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic." These rhyming couplets have been, you can see these produced in lots of places on the internet. They're repeated in a number of popular histories of this period. And, I think these are quite interesting. Reading around these two specific letters, you can see that these two men were really engaged with trying to play with different roots, different linguistic roots, to try to capture a sense for this word that not only was unique, but also respected a bringing together of different kind of genres. And for anyone who's interested, you can take a look at their correspondence in Psychedelic Prophets, where this is elaborated on a little bit. But they're very keen that they don't create a word that sort of pushes this way of thinking towards a particular sort of pharmaceutical response or a particular reductionist response. They want something that really sort of captivates the imagination of people working with psychedelics and working in psychiatry at this time. And I should say the psi disciplines more broadly. Sydney Katz, the journalist who came to Saskatchewan, described some of the ways in which in his case, LSD made him feel. So he talks about there being a lack of language. There are no words in the English language designed to convey the sensations I felt or the visions, illusions, hallucinations, colors, patterns, and dimensions which my disordered mind revealed. And in doing so, this just underscored the need for some kind of word to capture these ideas. But this was not just a superficial search for a linguistic category, but it really was, I think, sort of infused with these ideas about how we should think about trauma, who we should listen to, what kinds of experiences we use as evidence. So Osmond came to Saskatchewan, as I mentioned, in 1951, and he was right away faced with what he described as the Herculean task of reorganizing mental health services and a mental health system. Again, this is partially to coincide with a publicly funded healthcare system, but it's also a really significant moment within the history of psychiatry, as there are a variety of changes afoot. The introduction of psychopharmaceuticals being one piece of that, but also the changing paradigm in terms of using psychoanalysis as a leading or as a dominant way of engaging with psychotherapy, the relationship between pharmacotherapies and therapeutic components mixed with pharmacy and in what measure. And all of these things are really in flux and hotly debated. And certainly we see that expressed in the writings of Osmond and others as they are trying to sort out how best to deal with a major problem of psychosis. And that is one of the things that they see is the real sort of a real challenge within psychiatry. There's tremendous pressure to move people out of mental hospitals. There's tremendous pressure to downsize hospitals or to create community spaces. This beginning by the late 1950s and ramping up speed in the 1960s and 70s. And within that, Osmond and others are very keen to recognize that psychotic patients do not fare well in these changing environments. It's not just a matter of bringing down the walls of the asylum or the mental hospital, but psychotic patients actually need a different set of supports, and yet they're very difficult to connect with. Some of the psychedelic research that took place, as I mentioned, was trying to identify model psychosis or trying to use LSD in particular to antagonize feelings or to create a kind of way of empathizing or way of thinking about psychosis. Even though this was certainly disproved, and the notion of a sort of organic psychosis is very different from a chemically inspired psychosis, especially one inspired by something like LSD. Nonetheless, Osmond and others argued that not being able to trust your own senses and not being able to communicate was a valuable lesson. It was a humbling lesson. It was something that helped therapists sort of get on equal footing, or at least on similar footing with their patients. This is again Sydney Katz, because we have access to these photos. So I'm showing you here. So Sydney Katz is both staring into the folds of a towel, and he describes, what these look like caverns, and he's having a full-blown hallucination at this time. And you can see also that he's holding hands with Humphrey Osmond, who is also applying pressure to his head. It was a very tactile experience, and which was also important for the way they set these experiments up. A few other images from the graphic novel. These kinds of experiments very quickly and certainly spilled outside of a clinical context. Some of the research that was done took place in those hospital spaces, in clinical spaces, and some of them took place at dinner parties. And you can see this, this image trying to depict that kind of blending of things that we might say moves into recreational spaces, but it also brings in different disciplinary ideas. Aldous Huxley here is injecting his ideas about the way that psychedelics had made him feel on his first experience. Osmond himself, this is an example that he describes of when he had his own mescaline experience. He had several experiences, but this is one of them where he went for a walk with his wife, and he noticed the way that people's faces had changed. Wide open spaces changed, these vivid hallucinations that made him doubt himself and made him reflect on how those kinds of perceptual distortions might affect his behavior, and then what others might do in reaction to that behavior. And all of this was his sort of attempts to gather information and gather a kind of like empathetic perspective on psychosis. So here's just an excerpt from one of his letters again to Huxley, where he describes that one of the problems he felt with the kind of gap between a psychoanalytic response and the clinical trials that were increasingly taking place with pharmaceutical products was that there was a significant gap in understanding, or significant gap in sort of theorizing between these two models. So on the one hand, he says, these LSD trials, these psychedelic trials take place over 8 to 10 hours. You can see that I've highlighted that section here for you. And he said, but what ends up coming through in the published literature is an excised snapshot of that, which doesn't even summarize what has been said, but excises certain bits and pieces of those experiences. One of the things that Osmond's really frustrated with is that psychoanalysis takes a long time. It takes a lot of dedicated skill and patience and time, and all of the kind of information that is created is open to interpretation, whereas the clinical trial is trying to squeeze information through a very sort of reductionist model. And these two things are in opposition with one another, he argues. Again, I've got this sort of long section here, partly because I have a hard time cutting his words. He's got a lot of different ideas at once. Nonetheless, what I want to emphasize here is that by the end, he says, he poses this to Huxley, he says, one can hazard a dozen guesses, yet in each one is the question, why investigate at all if you cannot put up with what you find? And I think this partly gets at the crux of where Osmond is quite frustrated with the way in which we create and accumulate evidence, but then how we selectively use that evidence in this particular moment. And again, you can see sort of the gaps in the logic that he's driving at. He also suggests that the hallucination is, however, quite a minor matter compared with the transcendental experiences which so frequently turn up and which have so far received such scant attention that I doubt whether a casual reader would realize that they are frequently associated with mescal intoxication. He goes on to say, it's queer, for we are always emphasizing the need for showing the materialist way of life is not all. Yet when for years we have had at hand a tool which shows this with a painful obviousness, we take great care not to use it, or when we do, use it to emphasize such trivialities as the effect of mescaline on color or vision, which is rather like discussing an atomic bomb in terms of the color of its flash. Interesting, but trivial. And again, even in this kind of raw and candid way of expressing it, you can see him kind of grasping for ways of figuring out what do we do with the sort of powerful mind tools that he describes psychedelics to be. And yet the information is being squeezed into what he goes on more vociferously to argue is a kind of mismatched methodological approach or mismatched practice of using psychedelics as strictly in pharmaceutical terms without thinking about that therapeutic context and what kind of therapeutic practices are partnered with psychedelics at this time. I'm just got to find my place in my notes, apologies. So far from being reductionist, I think his conceptualization of experience embraced environmental influences as fundamental to how we perceive ourselves and how those perceptions affect communication. So they start playing with this idea of the Umwelt, or environment as experienced by the individual. And he argues that if we embrace psychedelics, we might be able to see and even articulate the Umwelt in a more specific way. So he says to Huxley, a dog's Umwelt is different from ours. It does not experience the world the same as a human being. And then he goes on to say, did I tell you of my experience of the dog world using LSD? The dog world is very different from ours and wholly different from our construction of it. Peppered throughout their correspondence, you see Osmond describing these, reflecting on times that he has gone through his own experiments and experiences. And he uses that to sort of animate and inspire some of his own work. So he follows a kind of Jungian tradition and starts to think about perception, or the notion of a filtered experience of the world that prevents us from perceiving deeper or more fuller truths. And this becomes a theme in his correspondence as he's trying to understand which kind of theoretical influences to draw into his practice as he begins to think about psychedelics and therapies in a kind of psychotherapeutic sense. Psychedelics seem to reveal an entirely new domain of experience. And to him, this begged the question, why do we experience the world as we do and not in some other way? Now, Huxley elaborates on this notion in his writing of The Doors of Perception, but the kernel of interest was already apparent in their first meeting, and you already see this coming through in the way that they are talking with each other. Osmond reiterates this kind of idea to Huxley in 1953. He says, psychosocially, these ideas are as good as ever. The doors of perception are cleansed. More gets in, and the mind-brain attempts more or less successfully to organize new information. And they're really committed to this idea that psychedelics open up the capacity for perception, and by this, experience. And they become enthusiastic explorers of empathy in the human mind. Their in-depth discussions about the role of madness in its containers, whether those are classification systems or a mental institution, tapped into broader sentiments about human evolution, civilizing trends, empathy, and the tolerance for difference. And their ideas remained predominantly intellectual, but Osmond's actions as a practicing psychiatrist suggest that he had genuine attempts to humanize madness in practical and administrative ways. Now, it may not be surprising to any of you to learn that Osmond was quite critical of the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, which of course the first one was introduced in 1952, around the same time that Osmond was investigating psychedelics. And he attempted to articulate a different way of imagining models of madness. He published his own Models of Madness guide as well. At the crux of his approach lay a belief in the power of medical models to help guide our understanding of how to manage madness. So that is, if schizophrenia was considered a biochemical brain disorder, then a person with schizophrenia bears no responsibility for that disorder and deserves to be treated humanely and not blamed for their disorder. Patients, he argued, have rights as well as responsibilities. They have the duty to learn about the illness, seek treatment, and try to get well. And psychedelics had facilitated some of his inquiries, inspired him with new insights, and likely enlivened many conversations with an expanding network of curious participants. But those experiences fueled his already well-developed convictions for understanding human perceptions, disordered thoughts, and a history of attempts to pathologize such people. So in other words, he'd always been curious about what constitutes authority and how some groups wielded it over others. In this way, he was much more like his intellectual contemporaries, who provided intellectual fodder for the postmodern turn by dismantling established theories of power, governance, and biopolitics, to name a few. I haven't seen Osmond described as an anti-psychiatrist or even sort of fitting into that set of literature, but I think his critiques of psychiatry at this time actually fit more closely with some of those more famous critiques. He's an interesting character in that he is challenging these notions, but at the same time, he reifies some of the importance of psychiatry. He felt that the sick role had been incorrectly defined and it was being used inappropriately, which led to an idea that psychotic disorders, and schizophrenia in particular, described people who were sick and therefore unable to fulfill their roles in society. He suggested that we need to redefine the sick role as being only one of the roles that a person plays in society, allowing for a broader sort of blend of rights and responsibilities. And that if broadened into this larger spectrum of rights and responsibilities, this could lead to the recovery of other roles. And his insights were quite timely, both in terms of his connections with psychedelics, but also with a kind of rising tide of mental patient activism, ex-patient activism, consumer activism, survivor activism, depending on the kind of political language at this time. And here, this is an example of a website in Canada that has drawn attention to the Mental Patients Association. This was one in Vancouver, which identifies as the first Mad Pride organization in Canada. And interestingly, I have found that in some of the ex-patients and mental patients' rights organizations, Osmond is cited and sort of championed or celebrated as someone who had championed these rights early on. So I think that as researchers debated the nature of illness and its resultant treatments, patients' experiences differed dramatically. New approaches to understanding and categorizing illness at mid-century created new labels for experiences and new explanations for behavior, character, habits, and even relationships. This is an image from the hospital in Weyburn where Osmond worked. This is sort of used in a pamphlet to signal the dawn of deinstitutionalization, or as they then called it, care in the community. And I want to talk now, this is the hospital that he worked at after it closed. This was a picture that was taken in the early 2000s, actually by my mother. It just happened to be a gloomy day when she took that picture. It was boarded up for many, many years. But I want to move on to one of the experiences of a nurse and former patient at Weyburn Hospital. Kay Parley was one person who reflected on what the role of psychedelics meant to her as both as a former patient and as a nurse in the Weyburn Hospital. Kay had her first breakdown as an when she was in her early 20s, and she was moved into the institution. She was described as having bipolar disorder. She went into remission, and after a while, she went to nursing school and came back to work at the hospital as a nurse. She wasn't supposed to have a psychedelic experience because that was not encouraged for people who had a history of psychosis. And yet Francis Huxley, Aldous Huxley's nephew, was visiting the institution. He was living there for 2 years and offered her LSD in a more recreational setting. And so she was written about this and reflected on what this meant for her, both as someone diagnosed with psychosis, but also someone who was a caregiver to people with psychosis. So Kay says that, let's see if I've got this up here. So she published this under her pen name, Norma McDonald. That's why there's 2 different names there. She says, I had all the symptoms of manic depressive, psychosis, paranoia, or even a character disorder coupled with neurosis. I still don't know whether I really had schizophrenia, what type of schizophrenia I had. I don't think I want to know. It would be entirely irrelevant. I've had to adjust to this strange, upsetting personality, and I've learned to cope with some of the facets of it while others are still baffling me. Labeling it with a name wouldn't be of any use and might complicate things more by setting up a number of expectations. For Kay, she explained that living with schizophrenia can be a living hell because it sets one apart from the trend of life followed by the majority of persons today. But seen from another angle, it can be really living, for it seems to thrive on art and education. It seems to lead to a deeper understanding of people and liking for people. It's an exciting life, like being an explorer in a territory where no one else has been. So straddling this identity that was characterized by unconventional expressions or suppressed reactions, Kay Parley asserted her independence without admonishing her schizophrenia as an illness simply in need of eradication. The image here is depicting her own psychedelic experience, which she described as relatively negative. She did not enjoy the experience, and yet upon reflection, so in the moment, she felt paranoid. She felt sort of the edges of her body leaking away, and she felt that she was no longer in control of herself. And yet by the end of the experience, as you can kind of perhaps gather from the way that the depiction here suggests that Francis Huxley is trying to guide her through, in the end, she felt that this actually gave her great comfort, that having a psychedelically triggered experience or a chemically inspired experience helped her to make sense of her own psychosis, her own illness. Kay went on for years to be described as one of the best psychedelic guides in this clinical context. And she likens it, and she is still alive today, 98 years old. She still talks today and has been interviewed on the radio recently, describing how these experiences gave her great insight into those kinds of disordered perceptions, that disordered speech, the difficulties of expressing oneself. She felt that being able to appreciate that and listen and to validate those experiences was something that needed to be taken up in a therapeutic context. That it was not psychedelics alone, but it was psychedelics and the ability to appreciate, understand, or just believe the kind of unreal things that people were describing. Huxley here, Francis Huxley says, that she's one of the strong ones. And apparently he actually said this, but I've seen this mentioned a number of times, that the way that Kay's role as a guide and as a nurse, and sometimes those words are used interchangeably in this history pertaining to her specifically. I think it was really one of the really significant moments. So I want to conclude then. I'm going to take a couple of steps back here. Current scientific studies are turning back to psychedelics with fresh eyes and new energy. And a new generation of investigators, including many of you here, I believe, are beginning to lay the groundwork for asking big questions about how we define and manage human behavior, whether it is in areas of addiction, trauma, pain, spirituality, end-of-life care, the list goes on. Despite the dramatic changes in our health and in the expansion of pharmacare options since the mid-20th century, several areas of human suffering remain untouched in terms of therapeutic progress. Psychedelics not only offer a different set of pharmaceutical options, but at the crux of psychedelic science is a different conceptualization of health and its care, including how we combine theories, approaches, and professional energy devoted to the therapeutics side of pharmacotherapeutics. Historically, psychedelics entered Western medicine at an auspicious time, appearing in a period of professional flux as the professionalization of mental health services engaged psychoanalysts, biological psychiatrists, and pharmacologists in particular in debates over whose theories had the most to offer. Historians have described this period as significant for introducing a psychopharmaceutical paradigm that eventually dominated this discussion, and many would argue had as much to do with economics as professional or disciplinary turf wars. I believe that here in 2021, we may be witnessing another significant moment, one that involves a deep questioning of this paradigm. As a historian, I know it is a cliche to suggest that in order to change things in the future, we need to look at the past, but in this case, I really agree. There may be much to criticize about 1950s psychedelic science, and we can certainly discuss some of those critiques, but I think there's also much to be gained by revisiting this past and by exploring some of the theories and tools that led to interdisciplinary and interprofessional cooperation in an effort to better understand experiences and how experiences fit into therapeutic systems. It has always struck me that the psychedelic scientists, the psychedelic therapists who remain very committed to their work, who, and I will point to the white jackets here again, those who maintained a sense of professionalism, not the ones who lost their jobs at Harvard and promised to create a new sort of spiritual awakening for the modern world by putting acid in the water supplies. I'm trying to give a whole presentation without saying Timothy Leary. But for those who remained committed to seeing psychedelic science kind of move through different professional ranks and methodological ranks, it's interesting to me that it was so important to so many of them that they go through that experience themselves, that they open their eyes to the idea of changing their own minds, of studying their own minds, of exploring consciousness in ways that has a lot more to do or looks a lot more like psychoanalytical training than pharmaceutical investigations. I think there is something to be learned here about the blending of those ideas that made for what I would argue was a more successful model for psychedelic science. And if we look around, they were some of the only models that were allowed to continue after the prohibition in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And I hope that this is a model that we can learn from as we go forward today. Thank you so much for your time.